Go with computer. All right, we'll see how it goes. So, good morning. How's everybody? Sorry, I was taking a little while. I'll say it's because I'm much older. Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. I'm much older now because today, yes, today's a very important historical day. It is my birthday. So that's going to be my excuse for being slow because I'm older now. You can tell. You can look at my face, go like, dang, she's old. There you go. Okay, we're going to start with scheduling made easy, it says. Why did it say that? We'll start with timed question review. Okay. Can you see it? Or do you see scheduling made easy still? I'm going to assume you see it unless you say something which may not work because it said my speaker doesn't work, or put in the chat like, hey, we can't see it. So here's your list of stuff. Somebody's putting stuff in the chat. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So from chapter 13, Reasons for Texas Independence, and, just freedom in general, and they didn't like being Catholic or not officially being able to own slaves, didn't think the government was responsive enough, that sort of thing. Typically, people will mention, the slave thing, because there were a lot of slaveholders in Texas. Reasons for Congress to favor and oppose the Mexican War had a lot to do with gaining territory, and in both ways. Everybody wants to gain territory, manifest destiny, that idea God wants us to take over as much land as possible. However, the North doesn't want it all to be in the South. So that's sort of a problem. That's why your friend Abraham Lincoln opposed the Mexican War, voted against it. And then later on, when he runs for president, people go like, he's not patriotic. He doesn't love the military. He didn't vote for the war. It's like, yeah, they did politics back then the same way, kind of, that they do it now. Make sure you know about the Wilmot Proviso or Proviso. I hear people say it that way from time to time. But you won't have to say it unless you just want to. Go around and tell all your friends. That was the addition to, well, not addition, but discussion of after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo at the end of the Mexican War. The idea was if we let the new states in, they have to be free of slavery. And that's not because this dude was an abolitionist. He was not, even though the tradition of his state was an abolitionist tradition. His thought was, we want to keep land open for white guys. He's one of the free soil guys. Political parties, Democrats at this point are, this is not exactly in the order that they appear, but Democrats are just Democrats. But when the Whigs break up, Democrats are those leftover dudes from the Jackson Party. Yeah, so, and pretty much if you're in the South, you're a Democrat during that time period. And honestly, up until the time, well, really up until, before you guys were born, but when I was in college, is when, in the 80s, is when you start to see that solid shift in the South from Democrat to Republican. But South, traditionally Democrats, and Democrats are going to get the leftover Whigs. When the Whig Party breaks up, it breaks up over slavery. Remember, the Whigs were the We Hate Jackson Party. So, after Jackson's gone a while, that's not a real viable reason to form a party. So they split over slavery. The anti-slavery Whigs joined the Republican Party. The pro-slavery Whigs joined the Democrats. The Free Soil group will be kind of absorbed by the Democrats because they really can't manage as their own party. So the Republicans are a coalition of people who oppose slavery. And the Free Soil Party, those guys are not exactly abolitionist. Excuse me. Instead, they don't want the spread of slavery, which is different than being an abolitionist because a majority of people in that party, their concern is they want the new land in the West to be available for white guys. Yeah, that's what they want. So there you go. Know Nothing Party, that was the anti-immigrant party. They had some success in certain states, usually states with urban areas and lots of new immigrants, because their big thing was they hated immigrants. So there you go. All right. Sorry. All right. Sorry, water. Let me try that. God, I mowed the lawn yesterday. I'm going to blame that. I think that is actually what it is. And stuff that leads to the Civil War. We got Bleeding Kansas, which is after Kansas, Nebraska. Did we talk about the Sumner Brooks affair? I don't know that we did. New book does. But the Sumner Brooks affair, there was a dude, Charles Sumner, who was a senator from Massachusetts. And then there was a senator from South Carolina, Preston Brooks. And in their debates over slavery, Charles Sumner gives a speech one day and he says, you know, it's evil people like Preston Brooks who defend slavery and own slaves, that kind of stuff. And then Preston Brooks' nephew was in the House of Representatives, and he witnessed the speech, and then he comes over and beats Charles Sumner's over the head with a cane. Now, I know that our politics are not great. We typically don't have people beating each other over the head in the Senate chambers. So a sign that it could be worse, maybe. But Charles Sumner has to go to the hospital, stays there for, seems like a year. I mean, it's a really long time. Sanitarium is what they called it, because it cracked his skull. I mean, he was not the same after. But his constituents kept reelecting him. And why can I not remember the name of the nephew? But his constituents also kept reelecting him. And they also sent him canes because his cane broke when he hit the guy over the head. I know, it's really weird that they would think that was cool enough that they would send canes. Yeah, I feel like that was in 56 when that happened. Dred Scott, which was 58, no, 59, I think. And then John Brown, which is the, Dred Scott was the Supreme Court decision that said if you're Black, you're not a citizen, and that no state has the right to regulate, I'm so sorry, regulate slavery. And that causes some trouble. It's also why we end up with the 14th Amendment. We'll talk about that a little today. And then John Brown and Harper's Ferry, they tried to take the federal arsenal, knowing essentially it wasn't going to work, but that it would be a spark that maybe would push people to begin to end slavery. So, yeah, there you go. And then when Lincoln gets elected, South Carolina said, we're out. And a bunch of southern states we mentioned made sure that he wasn't on the ballot. So that way they say we didn't vote for him, he's not our president. And he wasn't, or he was, you know, all right. Although I have relatives that, you know, depends on which president, say that the current president or the past president is not their president. Sorry, that's not how it works. Except during this time period where they just said, okay, we're out, which is weird. Sorry. And here's the rest of the list. It's nicely color coded. So 13, 14, and 15. The bonus of this unit is only 3 chapters. So that's cool. All right. Also, I know I've graded several things, and I know I said this earlier, but if you've turned something in, I haven't graded it. It could be because you turned it in really late, and I kind of want to know why. I've mentioned that a few times. So if you could send me an email that explains at the beginning. You may have already. I haven't checked email this morning. So I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm going to grade it eventually, but I'd rather know why. You know, it was late. I would, but I'll grade it either way. And certainly you should expect if it's pretty late that there's some points off. Also, what else? Yeah, I give examples of stuff. Yeah, in that the document question, that question 4 and 5, especially 4, kind of where I want to see an example or two from the text of whatever it is you're looking at. And also, I still don't get why when you guys answer questions, you're not using the textbook. Use the textbook. I mean, the questions are designed for the textbook. You know what I'm saying? All right. I won't eat any more grapes after that. Document analysis. That's what I wanted to look at. Okay. Document analysis. Is that what you see? Document analysis. Okay. So Lincoln's second inaugural and really nice speech. Oh yeah, I pasted it in. And the text's a little big, but even that, see how short it is? Lincoln, just a brilliant speech writer, giver. That's what I don't know. We don't have any audio of the speech. I do remember reading some stuff about the Gettysburg Address. And after he gave the Gettysburg Address, people either thought it was incredibly brilliant and concise, or they thought, it's such a big event, why didn't he give a longer speech? Which I thought was interesting. But I think in that era, they appreciated the longer speech and sort of expected it. Lincoln was not the longer speech guy. Yeah. Although, Lincoln Douglas debates, he could talk for a while if he needed to. But the truth is, I mean, after like 5 minutes, you guys aren't listening to me. So president doesn't want to give a long speech in the modern era. Dang, do you watch the State of the Union? Crud, things go on forever. All right, but the stuff that people tend to think is important about this speech really is kind of this last phrase is usually the most famous, most quoted part right there. With malice toward none, charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for all him who shall have borne the battle, for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And this, as far as timing, this is right before the war ends, right before. They know it's going to end. Yeah. And they know the North is going to win. At this point, it's really obvious. And when he talks at the beginning, like when I gave the first speech, there were problems. The Civil War was just about to start. They had no idea how it was going to turn out. And so this is the thing, this is how it turned out. And one of the things I think that's notable in here is that he's really not blaming just the South. He says that both parties caused this war. Let me see if I can find that. All right. He does certainly say, well, the part of the country that had slaves really, more at fault, but yeah. Both parties deprecated war. One would rather make it and let the nation survive, and the other would accept it to let it perish. That's an interesting phrase as well. But he does talk about how, both parties, I think this is an interesting phrase as well, and then I'll stop talking about this and we'll get on to the notes. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God. I think that goes back to our justification of slavery exercise. And then, I was telling someone, I don't know, a friend of mine, I don't know that I'll ever do a document analysis that has scripture in it, Bible verses anymore. And I do, I'm not trying to, because I know a couple of you wrote in your answers, like, this is not my thing. And I promise you, I'm not trying to harass you at all. It was just a super common thing for politicians, public figures, that stuff, to invoke the Bible because that's what they did back then. So I'm really not trying to harass any of you, and also not, I think the both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invoke his aid in the other. And I think that's a reminder as well that many of you pointed out in the other document exercise that we can all use our religion to justify what we do. And here we have two sides doing the opposite things, and they're both saying God's on our side. So, yeah. But the malice toward none thing is often quoted. So, all right. And let me check what you're saying. State of the Union. Yeah, that thing can go on. It can. Well, and now it's so much more. I mean, it's always been a political speech, of course, but it's more so now because you get the clapping. Yeah. I'm always entertained because, one side claps, the other side stays seated. All right, and then the Unit 4 questions, we'll look at those. Unit 4 questions. Yesterday's was to analyze the arguments of the Free Soil Party. How did its members understand freedom? And how did slavery fit into their platform? And today's basic premise of the Confederate government. What advantages did the Confederacy have? And why did its leaders think they would win? That sounds like kind of the same question I asked about the United States when they became the United States and declared independence. Yeah. Why did we win the war? So there you go. All right. What is next? Oh yeah. Notes. Let's go with notes. All right. I think I don't understand why all the documents show up, but there they are. Sorry. All right, and you guys see the notes? We're good. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I was thinking that somewhere yesterday I'd put page numbers for the question, and there they are. Free Soil Party 501 to 503. I don't know which question I would answer. Thank you. I do know which question I would answer. I would answer the one about Reconstruction because, I have opinions. But I don't know which one would be easiest. The most concise one would be the Free Soil Party. That really is about free soil. Sorry. It's not about Dred Scott. But I think that's the most concise one. Although, Confederate question, that's not bad either. It's not hard to figure. All right. And then when I notice page numbers, I'll put them in there. All right. Civil War. Here we go. War. Yeah, I know that I mentioned this in somebody's answer. Was talking about one of their teachers that called it different things. When I was a kid, it was and I grew up in a little more of a pro-Southern sort of place than a pro-Northern sort of place. But it was war between the states or the war of Northern aggression. Can you imagine? War of Northern aggression. But it's funny too, because historically, it's my impression that right after the Civil War, they kind of, acknowledged that it was a fairly heinous thing, that really more the fault of the South than the North, and that it had something to do with slavery. And then as time goes along, the view of the Southern cause sort of softens, and people refer to it as the lost cause, or, they talk about how it was just a noble attempt to preserve Southern heritage, that kind of stuff. And then it becomes the War of Northern Aggression, or the war between the states, or, something along those lines. And then I think I know that there's a pushback against that teaching of the war, probably about when I'm in elementary school, because we don't trust the government, because it's right after Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement. So we just assume if the government says something that it's wrong, and then we kind of re-examine all kinds of stuff. So then it kind of pushes back to probably more like the Civil War is typically taught today, except maybe, I don't know how it's taught in the South. I know that I'm in the South, kind of. I don't know if we think of Texas as the South. And I teach the Civil War, so I know how I teach it. But, I always have the students like, no, you're not teaching it right. It's not about slavery. It's about states' rights. Okay, if you want it to be about states' rights, I'll play along. But what did the states want to control? I'm going to go with slavery. So if you want to put those two together, makes you feel better. But, remember that the main thing that the states really wanted to control, the thing they're arguing about, is slavery. It is the thing they're arguing about. It's why the South seceded, because, Lincoln hadn't done anything when the South seceded except get elected. But he had said the Union cannot permanently endure half slave and half free. So, they knew where he was headed. It was not a secret. Okay. All right. So, they did not leave the Union because Lincoln had a really heinous tariff policy. So, all right, back to business. Have I talked about that too much? Okay, here we go. 1860 Republican Party platform, different than any previous party platform because it took a stand on slavery. Now, in general, the party platforms did not, because people wanted to get elected, and they knew if they made a statement about slavery, that it was going to keep them from getting elected. And, that's what politicians want more than anything in life, I think, is to get elected. It's my impression. I don't know if they're always excited about what they're going to do when they get there. They want to get elected and they want to stay in office. Back then, it wasn't. Well, no, it was probably for some of the same reason. They wanted to make changes. Yeah, I'm being positive there. And they wanted to maybe have power. I don't know. Lincoln, I strongly suspect, wanted to make changes. He doesn't seem like I want power kind of guy. But all those guys whose names you don't know, between Lincoln and Jackson, I don't know where they fit in. All right, go on. That's what you're saying. Civil War was about states' rights. Sorry, I'm reading somebody's direct message out loud. I apologize. Yeah, I think that's more of a pro-South. When I taught, can I say out loud that I taught at Cedar Park High School? I know some of you know it anyway. Yes. I'm not sorry I taught at Cedar. I also taught at Leander High School before that. That was nice. Where else did I teach? Johnston High School, which is now East Side Memorial in Austin, and Dobie Middle School. Dobie, many of you go to Dobie Middle School? It was a long time ago when I taught there. I also taught in South Texas, Seal Junior High in Robstown. There you have the whole story. The places that I heard my teacher told me states' rights, I actually was Cedar Park, and I heard that a lot. And I think I heard it in South Texas as well, but not so much because honestly, I taught younger kids. But it was because that a really popular teacher in 8th grade who was a Civil War reenactor, and when he was the reenactor, he was on the Southern side. So I think he was just had a different perspective of it. I've certainly met him later and didn't think like he's, crazy Klan member or anything. He definitely was not, but he's an unusual fellow. I think if you are a war reenactor, that you have a different view. I don't mean a different, you've got an unusual appreciation of history. I love history. I do clear, here I am teaching it. I'm probably not going to dress up like it and, camp out in the middle of nowhere in the heat I wouldn't do that for any reason. So I'm just soft. Just go with that. All right, back to business. Apologies. But yeah, the southern states didn't put him on the ballot because that way they could say, not our president, we didn't vote for him, that kind of thing. Which, yeah. There you are. So start of the Civil War, really kind of like the thing that drove the South a little nutty was Lincoln won. And we know where Lincoln's headed. He said no spread of slavery. Union can't endure permanently half slave and half free. We know where Lincoln's headed. So, and Lincoln's goal initially, of course, is to preserve the Union, really the purpose of the Civil War at the beginning. And then in the middle, the purpose of the Civil War kind of turns into let's end slavery. It does. So, you always have those people that argue, well, the Civil War wasn't really to end slavery. Yeah, I get why you would say that, because definitely the stated purpose at first was to preserve the Union. But if it can't endure permanently half slave and half free, there's probably not going to be slavery. And then the stated purpose changes in the middle. Really, the Emancipation Proclamation does that. So, and the Gettysburg Address as well. So, yeah. at some point. All right. And then also, one of the things I really like about talking about Lincoln and the Civil War and politics is noticing that Lincoln's politics change and shift a little. I mean, it's not dramatically, like he was never a pro-slavery guy or anything like that. But, I think we've already mentioned at some point in his career, early, he was he favored colonization, where we free the slaves and then send them over to a country in Africa. And then what he figured out pretty quickly after, thinking about it, talking to people, becoming friends with Frederick Douglass, that sort of thing, is that that's kind of a racist position, or at least a position. I don't know that they would have considered it a racist position. I honestly don't know that that's exactly how they spoke about these things. But he certainly would have thought that it was a position that did not favor equality for Blacks and whites, and at least equality before the law, which, he's clearly going to push for. But you see his positions change over time, and you see, initially when African Americans are in the military, fighting for the North in the Civil War, and they're not paid the same, you see Lincoln require that they be paid the same, with the urging of Frederick Douglass and some demonstrations by African American soldiers. But he makes those changes in a time where those changes might not be popular. So Lincoln will do a lot of things that he thinks are right, knowing that they may not be popular, and knowing also that while the Republican Party definitely wants to fight the Civil War and definitely wants to end slavery, they typically want to end slavery. Most people who fight for the North fight because they were drafted or they're mad at the South. And most people who want to end slavery, they don't necessarily want equality. They surely don't want former slaves to move to the North. They don't. You'll notice this. But they do want the South to be harmed. So they think getting rid of slavery will harm the South economically. So he knows that if he takes some of these stands, it's going to be unpopular with people who support him, but it also is the right thing to do. And I like that about Lincoln. Yeah. And Lincoln, not even close to perfect. Nobody is. Did I ever tell you that I had a student? I know this was at Leander High School in the early days or the late days when I was there, because internet wasn't so much a thing when I first started there, because I'm old. I had a student who went on Wikipedia and changed Abraham Lincoln to being the biggest slave owner in US history. If you ever saw that article, that's not true. Also, why we don't use Wikipedia as a source, because a high school kid can change it for fun. I know. They review it and they'll change it back, but it could be 3 weeks later. Don't use Wikipedia as a source. Okay. But yeah, Lincoln, not a big slave owner, none of that kind of stuff. All right. So Lincoln gets elected, South begins secession. South Carolina is the first state to leave, and they pass an article of secession. And then this, I think his name's John Crittenden, Kentucky congressman, says, you know what? I think we can avoid a civil war if we can just get the Republican Party and the head of the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln, to agree that we could just have a constitutional amendment that preserves slavery forever where it already is. And Lincoln goes, no. It's like, did you not pay attention to the campaign? Come on. But, this is just, it kind of tells you where politicians were during this era. Their goal really is not necessarily to fix a problem, but just to avert a big consequence. So they wanted to make sure the Civil War didn't break out on their watch. So, and of course, Kentucky has a vested interest in this because they're right in the middle. So, there's a chance that there's going to be more fighting in the middle, because it's a civil war. So it could happen. All right. So no Crittenden Compromise. Not going to happen. Yeah. And he also wanted to restore the Missouri Compromise line. And there were also additional issues with that too, because the Supreme Court, we already have the Kansas-Nebraska fiasco, that sort of thing, although I know that Kansas became a free state. I know. But we'd already passed some other legislation that contradicted that, and the Supreme Court had already talked about how no state can limit slavery. So, oh my goodness, we got all kinds of things going on here where that probably isn't going to fix the problem. Now, the president before Lincoln was James Buchanan. James, do you know anything about James Buchanan? I don't know why you would. James Buchanan. If you ever have to research a president for some reason, just research James Buchanan. Just do it. I think it would be worth your time. Not because he's like super famous or does anything terribly important. I don't think he does. But you find out some interesting things about his personal life. But Buchanan does not want to be the dude who's on the watch when the Civil War breaks out. So the South takes over a federal fort. It would be like if you guys got a wild hair and said, we'll go take over Fort Hood. Don't do that, by the way. So they decided the South Carolina would be like National Guard, but state militia, when they took over the federal fort, and Buchanan went, okay, and just let it happen. He didn't do squat about it. Like, nope, because if I do, there's going to be conflict. I'll have to send the troops in, then there's going to be a fight, and then I got to do something. I'm almost done. I'm almost out. I don't want the war to start on my watch. So he just does nothing. So when Lincoln comes into office, he says, that Fort Sumter, that is a federal fort, and that seems to have been taken over by a southern state that just said they're out. So we are going to go into that fort, and we're at the very least going to resupply the fort. Now, Lincoln knows that if he sends the troops in to resupply the fort, there's going to be trouble. He knows that there's going to be trouble, but he also knows the war is pretty much inevitable at this point, but he doesn't want to be the one who, sorry, goodness. Starting to wonder how long class will be today. All right. He doesn't want to be the one who sends troops in and officially starts the war. So he's going to legitimately resupply a fort, and then when the South Carolina troops attack the federal troops, they're the ones who have made the attack. They're the aggressors. And the United States is just going to be responding to the aggression of South Carolina. I'm going to try a lifesaver. We'll see if that works. Goodness. I know I wasn't coughing before I started class, but I also wasn't talking. That was it, I think. All right, so Lincoln takes office, sends troops, excuse me, to resupply the Fort Sumter, and the Confederate forces, South Carolina forces. Fire on the troops and capture the federal troops. And Lincoln declares that to be an act of rebellion, officially starting the war. Okay. So you have the question, why did the Confederates think they might win, that sort of thing. I think if you look at this, we're talking probably starting pretty early in the chapter, so probably around page 520. And it tells you, about both sides, talks about combatants, public nature of the war, military strategies, how the war starts, that sort of thing. And I think probably if you go through about 527, you'll probably get all the stuff. Oh my goodness, what did I just do? That was crazy. I highlighted everything. I hope I didn't just erase everything. That's all right. I've got a saved copy somewhere, don't I? I'm sorry if that made you dizzy. Did that make you dizzy? No. Okay. So we said to 527. 520 to 527. I'm going to put the book over there. All right. All right. But that's where I look if I'm answering the what are the advantages of Confederacy question. Okay. They thought they had a better cause, a more inspirational cause. I don't know that they thought it was like superior, but they're defending their actual homes because most of the fighting is going to be in the South and their way of life. And to me, always the most fascinating thing about the South, the Civil War during this era, is how do you get a bunch of poor white guys to fight a war to preserve an institution that helps a bunch of rich white guys? But, you know, we talked about that a little bit with the, you had a question about that earlier. What is it that unifies people in the South? Sorry, man, my throat is messy this morning. And they talked about it. I mean, it had to do with the idea that slave owners, excuse me, non-slave owning whites eventually thought maybe they would be wealthy and own slaves. And they also had somebody beneath them on the socioeconomic strata if there were slaves. And then, you know, racial stuff. There's that as well. So, but defending their way of life. You know, Northerners don't have any business telling Southerners what to do, how to run their farms, how to run their lives. They mistreat immigrants. They do equally heinous things. So they don't have any right to judge, that sort of thing. They just need to mind their own business. Yeah. And the knowledge of the territory, of course, is going to be an advantage. And military leadership. The South did have potentially an advantage. I think historically people always say, you know, you got Robert E. Lee, he's a brilliant tactician, except, you know, a couple times where he launches an offensive, you know, into the North, and those are not terribly successful. But, you know, there's also the argument that, well, you know, they were going to lose and that was their best chance at changing the tide, that sort of thing. I'm definitely not a military historian. So I'm not the person to argue any of that stuff. There's been, you know, we talk about history revision a lot. I think Grant is usually seen as some drunk guy that the North had to settle on. And there's been a lot of revision about that in the recent era. There have been, you know, recent books about how, no, don't say that. Oh, no, you can say the North had all the weapons. You can say that, but don't say, remember, South had crops too. But I know what you're saying. No, you're exactly right. The North has probably the most important advantages on paper. Now, the reason the South was not discouraged by that is in the American Revolution. The British had all the advantages, the important advantages on paper. But we know who won. So the South is kind of taking courage from that. They are, for sure. So everything else. Oh, your question this week is not advantages. Oh, it's about the government structure too. So we'll have to add some points. It's why they think they would win. So this part's good. Okay, sorry. Having a little brain moment there. Between my brain and my throat this morning, it's not a good day, is it? So the South military leadership. Oh, yeah, there are historians now that think that Grant actually was better than he historically is given credit for. Usually he is kind of seen as the drunk guy that the North had to settle on. Now, I don't know, my students always seem to know that Grant had a drinking problem. My understanding of Grant, again, I'm not a Civil War historian. I'm definitely not a Civil War reenactor. I don't know an excessive amount. I mean, it's not the thing I'm most interested in. We've already talked about that, Constitution. But Grant, from my understanding, at this point did not have a drinking issue. He was not a guy who drank all the time. Was certainly sober and understood. I know, just from reading, not because I was there, that Lincoln settled with Grant as the commander, and they picked other people first because they had better grades. Can you imagine just picking people because they have good grades? Um, McClellan was the guy they picked first. He graduated first in his class at West Point. Lee graduated second, so he was even smarter than Lee. But he had trouble being decisive during battle because this is again why I can never be in the military. Your decisions are going to cause people to die in a war. And I think McClellan was pretty overwhelmed by some of that. So he couldn't make decisions quickly enough. It's also why I'm a very bad soccer referee. Yeah. Because like I pass the test every time, I do really well. But if you have to make those decisions in the middle of the action, whether it's a soccer game, which is as exciting as I need to be in, or a war, those decisions have got to be incredibly difficult, especially knowing that those decisions will cost people their lives. So McClellan was a good war games kind of general, but he was definitely not a good in the field sort of general. And Grant was. Grant was much better at that. And Lee apparently was quite good at that as well. And the South has a list. You always hear about Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Those are the ones you hear about. And then in the North, Grant and Sherman, unless you're from Georgia where you can't talk about Sherman. Okay. So advantages of the Confederacy. Way of life, protecting their way of life. The knowledge of the territory in a mostly defensive war. And military leadership. And it was true. Most plantation families, you went to college during this era to show off that you had enough money to go to college, maybe to get a military career, or to be a preacher. And in the North, people who went to West Point or military school, sometimes they were poor people who were trying to work their way out of being poor people. Yeah, and people still do that in the military, I'm pretty sure. My nephew was visiting, and we were talking about when his dad, my youngest brother, was thinking about joining the Navy, which is very noble. And don't get upset with me if you join the Navy. I told him, because my brother wanted to join the Navy really for one reason: free college. And I said, if that's the only reason you want to go, I'm not sure that's a wise decision, because there are other ways to get free college. The Navy is going to entail a few things other than free college. And in addition to free college, you might get a free trip to Iraq, because you might. So, and it may not be the free trip you were hoping for. So, yeah, he ended up not joining the Navy because he really did just want college. But in this era, it wasn't that you went for the free college, it was to give you an opportunity to have a career. Because, even in the North, if you lived in a city, there's a good chance you were poor. And if you lived in the country and didn't own good land, there's another good chance you were poor. So it was a nice way to, have an opportunity. Yeah. Yeah. Oh dear. Yeah. No, military service. God bless you folks that do that, because that is some rough stuff. I'm old, it's my birthday. We've already talked about this, but I have a contingent of uncles who all fought in Vietnam. Well, one side of the family, they all volunteered to fight in Vietnam. The other side, they all went to college excessively to avoid going to Vietnam. So when I teach 1302, it's kind of interesting for me because I've got, relatives on both sides of we should have stuck it out and done it right, or we had no business there. But yeah, the PTSD is, I see, I can't imagine. So yeah, blessings to anybody who willing to do that. No. And suffer through that. And it's a noble thing to want to serve other people. I know some of it's, we can always agree or disagree about war sort of stuff, but the people who are willing to do it, that's, usually it's a very noble reason that they do it. All right, back to talking about the Civil War, which is tricky too. And I think that's also why you saw some history revision, because so many people were harmed in the Civil War. You didn't want to say that something was not noble about their sacrifice, even though, Confederacy doesn't look so good, does it? All right, advantages of the Union, everything else, like you'd already mentioned. I think it was Thomas that mentioned it, but I can't remember. But weapons. Yeah, you've got all the factories in the North. I'm not saying they didn't have any factories, and they're certainly going to build some factories in the South, but weapons production, huge advantage for the North. I know the South can import stuff, but it's going to be hard because the North is going to block it. I know the North doesn't have a very big Navy, but at least they have one. So there you go. So the North has everything else. They have a dramatically larger population. Plus, you have a pretty large percentage of the population in the South that are slaves who, one, probably aren't volunteering to fight in the Civil War, although some of them did get sent. And two, if you're a slave owner, do you want your slave to go be trained using weapons? Because when they come back, that could be used against you. So, all right. A larger population, more money, established government, they have a larger tax base. They have the formal military. West Point's in New York, by the way, in case you weren't aware. International relationships, a navy, larger and more diverse economy, some manufacturing. Not, it's not the most in the world, but it's up and coming, and certainly more than the South has. Plus, those trading relationships won't get interrupted. So that certainly gives an advantage to the North. And the ability to create more manufacturing faster because of all the other stuff, more people, more cities, more money, more tax base, and food. That's why I was like, no, not in the crops. Remember that the South is, I know they grow corn and stuff, but they typically don't grow food as a cash crop. They grow it more to, feed their own family or feed, whoever lives on if it's a plantation. So food production on large scale is really more of a northern thing. Food as a cash crop is more of a northern thing. And that will end up being a problem for the South as time goes along. It will. So the first couple of years, the South is okay with food supplies, that sort of thing. The last couple of years, they're eating what they feed their animals. Yeah, it's pretty rough. Yeah. All right, names for the North. The reason I bring this up, one of my all-time favorite students, because she was one of my best friend's daughters, Leander High School, back in the day, long time ago. Like straight A student, she goes on to nursing school, straight A student there. She still got 4 perfect kids, runs marathons. She's just a brilliant young woman. She did not like history, and her parents homeschooled her. And her mom, one of my best buddies, also did not like history. So she went to Leander High School after the homeschooling through, I guess, middle school. And so, she's just knocking it out of the park in every class except US history, which is my class. And so, but she's such a diligent student. So she reads everything. She's trying to understand stuff. Her dad likes history. So she's trying to talk to him about history, but he gets frustrated with her because she just doesn't know very much about it. And so we're starting to talk about the Civil War, and she raises her hand and she says, Ms. Cerna, I have a question. And I went, oh, that's great, Lindsay. What's your question? And she says, you know how you said there's 2 sides in the Civil War? And I go, yes, I did say that. She goes, she says, I'm not trying to be disrespectful at all, but I think you're wrong. And I went, well, that's curious. Why do you think I'm wrong? And she says, well, I was reading the book and, talking to my dad and talking to some other people about the Civil War. And you said there's the North and the South, but they keep talking about the Yankees and the Rebels and the Union and the Confederacy and the blue and the gray. So I think there's more than two sides. And it was funny too, because everybody liked this girl and respected her so much that they didn't laugh at her, but you could see it on their faces like, oh my gosh, but they were really good. And I said, no, those are nicknames. And then, drew a little chart on the board because it was a long time ago. So I always think of Lindsay when I do this part of the lecture. So for the North, it's the Union, sometimes just the US, the Yankees and the blue. And the Confederacy are the Confederacy, the South, the Rebels, and the Gray, just in case you're in the same spot with Lindsay. Also, all respect to those of you who didn't grow up in this country and didn't get an early version of US history. So yeah, here we are. So, all right, it gets confusing. And wars are confusing to read about anyway, because you'll notice too, if you are, really kind of a fan of the Civil War, you know that each battle has a Confederate name and a Union name, and it's like, wow, that's so much. Yeah, but that's why military historians are special. They keep track of a lot of stuff. All right. First few years of the war, the South does pretty well in most of the major battles, but they start to run out of resources, including soldiers. Casualty percentages rates probably are higher for the North because they're losing quite a bit, but they have so many more people. Now, both sides are drafting. In the South and the North, you can get out of the draft by paying a fee, essentially, to pay your substitute. You could send a substitute or pay a fee to, replace yourself. In the South, the only people that could afford to do that were incredibly wealthy people. In the North, kind of upper middle class and wealthy people could afford to do it. So more people were doing that in the North, but there were, they didn't need soldiers the same way they did in the South. In the North, there's a really big urban draft. So they're drafting a lot of people from the cities, and they're drafting a lot of the recent immigrants. So, in the 40s, we're hating on immigrants, in 40s and 50s, and then in the 60s, we're drafting them to fight the Civil War. One of the other kind of odd things I think you'll notice as well is throughout our history, we'll have like a big group of immigrants, and whatever the biggest group is, we don't like them because there's too many of them. They bring down wages, all that sort of stuff. And maybe more true before there was a minimum wage, but you still hear that, in the modern era. But then there'll be a war and we'll draft a bunch of people from that immigrant group. It's like, nah, those guys are all right. So after the Civil War, the anti-Irish sentiment really kind of calms down. I think it's after World War I. I know that it's after World War I. The anti-Italian sentiment will also calm down because we'll have an anti-Italian time in our history. And after World War II, there's a really large number of Mexican Americans who are drafted. And there's definitely more respect, but also it's part of the impetus for Mexican American rights movement and American GI Forum, that sort of thing in the in Texas, especially was big. All right, back to this. So sorry. South does pretty well until they start running out of stuff, and resources does include soldiers. There's a few marginal victories at the end of 1862. And Lincoln's gone through 4 or 5 major commanders at this point, kind of settled in on Grant because he's having some success in the West and his casualty rates are high, but he consistently wins and no one else is consistently winning. So Grant is the dude. After some marginal victories in 1862, Abraham Lincoln makes the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation just essentially says that all slaves in contested territories are free. Now, we haven't really talked about the border states. Have we talked? No, we haven't. So during the Civil War, we got the North and the South, but there's those states in the middle. And the states in the middle are like, oh my gosh, we are kind of the conduit to the trade between the North and the South. We know that, most of our money comes from the North and a lot of our product comes from the South. They don't really want to pick sides. Some of the people in those states have slaves. So what eventually happens is those states decide that they will stay with the Union. And those are Missouri. These are postal abbreviations. I know people always wonder, like, why do you abbreviate states that way? Back when I was a kid, we had to learn those because we would mail things to people. People don't mail stuff anymore, so people don't tend to know them. So MO is Missouri, just trust me on that. Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. So these are the border states. They are part of the North. They're part of the Union, but they still have slaves. And I know you're going like, that's not right. Okay, that will end. Okay, but I understand what you're saying. Yeah, and again, I think it's really a sign that initially the war really was about preserving the Union. This is where the shift happened. So Lincoln says all the slaves in the rebellious states are free. And I know what you're saying. I know what you're thinking. That didn't really free anybody. No, it didn't really free. And yeah, I get it. But it's a sign that the focus of the war is changing, that it's no longer about preserving the Union, that it's about ending slavery. And I know you're thinking, well, if it's about ending slavery, why did they not also end slavery in the North? Good question. And they're going to do it over the next year or so. And I know you're going like, nah, they should have done it just then. They also understood that in those states, if they ended slavery immediately, that there could be little mini civil wars in all those states. So they end up putting troops in those states, requiring them to end slavery, and having troops in those states to help them end slavery. So they kind of have a little mini version of martial law in those states to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do, end slavery, but also don't rebel. So those states will end slavery, and there won't be slaves in those states by the end of the Civil War. So over the next year or so, that will be taken care of in those states as well, but not by declaration, by action. Yeah. Okay. So when the Civil War is over, there's really not slavery anymore. There really isn't. Now we'll talk. We've got the whole Reconstruction chapter, so I know some stuff goes on there. A lifesaver, that worked, didn't it? Okay, back to business. I was just noticing I wasn't coughing. So Lincoln's nervous about declaring emancipation. South was having military success, didn't want border states to leave the Union. As it becomes, the North becomes more consistent in winning battles, shifts the focus to the issue of slavery, and primary objective of the North shifts. And probably most important immediate effect of this is the North gets an influx of volunteers, abolitionists, primarily free Blacks, nearly 200,000 new soldiers in the middle of a war. And that has an amazing impact on the momentum, the change in momentum. So, and when those soldiers are allowed to join and start to serve, initially they're not allowed to be in combat, and then pretty quickly, was at St. James Island, I think. It's the Glory Regiment, the 54th Massachusetts, and that's the one Frederick Douglass's son is serving in. And Frederick Douglass and Lincoln will regularly consult either at the White House or at Frederick Douglass's house, which is a relatively short walk away. If you ever tour DC, if you could go to Cedar Hill, you might enjoy that as well. That's Douglass's house. I have a former soccer player who's going to Howard University. I saw him the other day and he goes, I'm going to Howard. I went, you are not going to Howard. And he goes, yeah, I am. But Howard's a beautiful campus as well. I remember just how weirdly impressive their libraries were, kind of marble floors and fireplaces and stuff. But anyway, all right. but that's close by as well. All right, so Frederick Douglass consults with Abraham Lincoln pretty regularly. They talk about race. Douglass insists for better treatment for Black soldiers, that they be allowed in combat, paid equally, and Lincoln follows through on these to a certain extent, and it does take time. The pay issue happens a little faster. The combat issue is a little slower. But, in an era where not very many people are going to agree with that, Douglass and Lincoln, Lincoln's power and Douglass's presence and intellect, I think, kind of pushed that through. So Douglass's son, 54th Massachusetts. Douglass also thought former slaves showed ownership of their own freedom by fighting directly for it, and certainly gave speeches that suggested that. All right, during the Civil War, civilian rights definitely limited. The North is going to declare martial law in many states, especially the border states, when they're getting rid of slavery, but also the hotbed of political unrest, Illinois and Indiana. I know when you think rowdy states, those are the ones you think of. But you honestly should, because, I know I was talking to, I don't know why we were talking about this, but my preacher at church always likes to talk about history to me. I don't know why. But you're saying, like, I grew up in Indiana and there was a lot of Klan activity there. And I went, yeah, I know there was a lot of Klan activity in Indiana. It's my job, not that I hung out, and, we talked about that. And there are things that you don't expect sometimes from certain places, but Illinois and Indiana really had a really strong pro-Confederate groups within those states in this era. So both of these states had pushes for secession, and it doesn't make sense. You've seen the map. It doesn't make sense, but they did have these pushes, and they had to be suppressed with troops. And there's this Lambton Milligan fellow who I think, he was the dude that led the secession movement in Indiana, and he just wouldn't cut it out. So Lincoln just said, just go arrest him for treason. And they did, and he had a court martial rather than a regular court because martial law, and they sentenced him to death, which is too much, probably. The Supreme Court said it was too much. Now, remember, too, the Supreme Court's a lot more pro-South than North during this time period, but, the whole purpose of the First Amendment was political speech, and this is definitely political speech. So executing somebody because they disagree with your political stance, and he didn't lead a rebellion, it wasn't anything like that. But also, they said he was fomenting one, that because he kept talking about secession, it was leading people to rise up, that sort of thing. And his lawyers were going to argue, of course, freedom of speech, but also that you can't have a military tribunal if you're not in the military. Just because they had declared martial law didn't mean everybody there was now in the military. He was supposed to have a civilian trial, and the courts definitely agreed with that and let him out. Of course, they let him out well after the war is over, but All right. South also practiced martial law and confiscation, because as they started to run out of food and equipment for their soldiers, they just took it from civilians. They said, yeah, war effort, we're taking this stuff. So they did. All right. I'm always impressed by all the stuff that goes on in the United States during the Civil War. And here's some things that go on during the Civil War that are not related to the Civil War. I keep shaking my head because I am having phone calls non-stop. Do you guys have this problem? You're in your class trying to teach a history lesson, and everybody is calling. No one ever calls me when I'm not having class. Stop. All right, I'll try to stop shaking my head about my phone. Sorry. In the meantime, U.S. government, non-Civil War activities. These are important things. Morrill Land Grant Act, which sells government-owned land and uses the proceeds to build A&M or A&I colleges. A&M is agricultural and mechanical, and A&I is agricultural and industrial, or agricultural and what's the other I? Oh, I don't remember. All right. Purchase of Alaska from Russia during this time period to expand U.S. territory to the north and the west. When we bought Alaska, we really just wanted to have a spot up there more for strategic purposes, maybe to help with trade a little. We had no idea if there's anything cool there. People joke that we bought it because the cows gave ice cream instead of milk, which would be cool. Plan to build the Transcontinental Railroad is developed during this time period from Omaha, that would be Nebraska, by the way, to Sacramento, California. And you're thinking that's not really transcontinental. They'd already built, to the Midwest, so it's just finishing the trip. Congress passed the Homestead Act, which gave out free land to people that want to move pretty far west. And we're talking really, this is more like Oregon and Washington, kind of that area. And a lot of people will move west. Millions of people will move west because of that. So the government wanted to fill the land east to west, and this is about controlling Native Americans. Because at this point, we're starting to put Native Americans onto reservations, and they don't want to stay. So the thought was, if you fill up the land, they'll have to stay. Was a fairly effective strategy. And also after this, if you kill the buffalo, they'll also stay on the reservation. Also a fairly effective strategy. About a third of these several million farm families who moved west kept their farms. 2/3 did not, but they sold them to the more successful farmers and then probably started a business. Almost everybody who moved west stayed west. All right. Business opportunities because of the Civil War, shipping, and telegraph lines. And Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt, will be big on both of those things. And your future super rich guys, Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller, will get government contracts, yes, to supply metal, iron, and steel. Steel's super expensive to make during this time period, but they'll figure something out. We'll once again steal industrial technology from England. It's kind of what we do. Bessemer process. Petroleum products for the war, and these guys are going to start to make more money. So these guys are going to go from really successful businessmen to super rich. Yeah, they'll be the Kardashians of the time period. I don't know if they're the Kardashians of the time period. But not everything is perfect. In the North, even though things are going better. Lincoln wants to use the power of the military to end slavery, does think that blacks deserve measures of equality. Not everybody in the North agrees. Average white person, Northern soldiers, probably not fighting because they're fighting for equality. They're fighting because they don't like the South and they got drafted. And there's some pretty heinous riots in New York City, draft riots. The frustration seems to come when primarily immigrant Irish folks are drafted. Their families are frustrated because they've lost their major wage earner. Being in the military doesn't pay super well now or during this time period. And African Americans who weren't being drafted initially end up taking their jobs. So rather than being frustrated at the government or, maybe unfair draft policies, they have riots and they burn down Black neighborhoods. They burn down an orphanage in this instance as well. And this happens mid-60s in the middle of the Civil War. And the government wasn't drafting African American men, so they were behind. And they stayed, in the cities and ended up taking jobs. Now, the Black population in New York City was not very large. Also, very common in cities during that era for people to live within their own ethnic group. Now, there were also it was going to be more than custom, and I know that you're aware of that. You know, as time passes and cities start to make laws about where you can live, where you can do business, that sort of thing, they're going to put into law and then into custom that you'll have ethnic neighborhoods. So, you know, initially it happens really because you live near who you go up with or who you know or who you immigrate with. But over time, it's going to be codified. It'll become part of the law. King cotton diplomacy, the South really thought that because they're this massive supplier of cotton throughout the world, that that will be so important that Great Britain and France will risk any sort of political difficulty with the North and will still trade with them. And nope, they're not having it. They're not trading with them, and they're not recognizing them as an independent country. So their cotton markets are going to dry up, and those nations will start buying cotton from India and Egypt, maybe a little from Venezuela, but mostly India and Egypt. And their cotton economy never recovers. So, you know, they've gone from supplying cotton to 85 to 90% of the world to not being able to sell their cotton. And the only place they can sell it really is they kind of smuggle it to the North. Yeah, instead of kind of switching and growing food, which they desperately needed, they continue to grow cotton. Yeah. All right. Important military victories and turning points for the North. It's tricky when you have survey class and there's a war and it's not all about the war. So stuff that you need to know for the war. Couple of turning point victories. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, you have the very famous Gettysburg Address, first marginal major victory. By marginal, I mean there are enormous casualties on both sides, but the North holds the ground. And if you're wondering why did they fight in Pennsylvania, because this is one of those times where Lee brings his troops out of the South into the North, and that typically works very poorly. They did much better fighting a defensive war, but this is where the battle was starting to turn, where the North was having more success. So, you know, the attempt was to sort of get things back in the South's favor, and it doesn't go well. And the North sustains really heavy casualties as well. It's just they can survive it better than the South. And reemphasizes the morality of the cause of ending slavery, dedicates the cemetery, you know, becomes sort of a national memorial sort of thing. And then Vicksburg, Mississippi, where Grant takes control of the, I didn't put a date on this, but it's also in 63. Let me see if there's in there. You notice that there's a timeline in each book. Yeah, I think it's right around the same time as it's summer of 63. I'm pretty sure it may have been right before, so maybe it was June. But at any rate, Vicksburg also in 63. Grant's army gets control of the Mississippi River and starts to accomplish what they called the Anaconda Plan. Anaconda being a giant snake that squeezes the life out of things. So they're going to squeeze the life out of the South's trade. So they've cut off the coastline, so that blocks them from international trade. And for internal trade, if they are able to block the Mississippi River, that will accomplish the squeeze. So that's what they're able to do here. It's going to cut off commerce and supply lines for the South, and the North will pretty much win everything after this. And this is where the Southern supplies really start to dwindle. Okay. The other stuff you just have to know for this chapter. The amendments, the Civil War amendments, they're not all passed during the Civil War. The 13th Amendment is, but the others begin to be discussed. And then the 13th is passed during the Civil War. 14th and 15th are referred to along with the 13th as the Civil War amendments, because they're passed because of the Civil War. So the 13th ends slavery. The 14th provides equal citizenship and equal protection for former slaves. It essentially says if you're born here, then you're a citizen. And the purpose of that was what I just may have said, to make former slave citizens. Now, I know in the modern era, it has a different use, which is protected by the Supreme Court. They've said that that's fine as well. You see people maybe who weren't born in the United States. I have a friend who came to the United States she came illegally. She is legal now, but she came illegally because she was pregnant and her child was born here, so her child could be a citizen. And that's kind of the more, I guess, modern, slightly controversial version of the 14th Amendment. But the purpose then really was to reverse the Dred Scott decision, because the Dred Scott decision said that if you were Black, then you could not be considered a citizen and didn't have the protections of citizenship. So this says that if you're born here, you're a citizen, and it doesn't have any qualifications related to race or ethnicity. It also doesn't have any qualifications related to sex, which is going to be an issue we'll talk about in the next chapter. And then the 15th Amendment says that all former slave citizens have the right to vote. Yep, I think your teacher did a wise thing, free citizens vote. And I think there's logic to it, but also that's a super nice way to remember. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I would occasionally mention that to the younger folks as well. So thank you for bringing that up. Smart teacher, they served you well. Good job. All right. And General Sherman is going to give, and they'll talk more about this in the 15th chapter. General Sherman is particularly unpopular in Georgia. Because his tactics included total war. So it's kind of the slash and burn, destroy everything in your path sort of thing to demoralize the people you're fighting against, so they'll just leave, go home and protect their families and their property, that sort of thing, rather than stay and fight, or they just give up because, fighting is going to lead to their death and destruction. So, at this point, the North is definitely going to win. So Sherman is really taking it to the South. And in a civil war, that tactic might seem a little harsh. In war, your goal is to win. But in a civil war, you've got kind of a different situation potentially, but you do still need to win the war. So some people thought his tactics were pretty harsh. But one of the interesting things that he does that, people don't look at and go like, what the heck was he doing? In South Carolina, when they get control of South Carolina, he takes the land from the slave owners and redistributes it to the slaves. And there had certainly been talk about that. That's where the whole 40 acres and a mule phrase comes from. So the thought was that when the slaves are freed, they will get the land owned by their former owners. And the reason for that, of course, in the South, and was kind of true in the Midwest as well, is that if you don't have land, you don't have wealth. Your wealth resides in your land. And the land that was redistributed, these folks were very productive and made plenty of money. And, in many ways, you're thinking, why wouldn't they? They were the ones that always did the work anyway. So they know when to plant, how to do it. I mean, they know all the day-to-day activities of running whatever sort of farm for whatever it is that they're growing, which could have been cotton in South Carolina, but could have been some other stuff as well. They grew rice, and I don't know that they still grew a lot of indigo during that time period. I don't think that was quite as trendy, but there were probably a few more food crops in the northern part of the Carolinas. But Sherman redistributes I almost made it through class without a yawn. With Sherman redistributes the slave owners' land, and the former slaves have great success. They do. And it leads to hope, throughout the South, that when the war is over, that the former slaves will be given land and that they'll have an opportunity to gain wealth, that sort of thing. So, you know, it leaves them with some promise that things are going to go well for them during the period of reconstruction. Yes. All right. That was a long talk, wasn't it? I skipped over some stuff in the chapter, of course. A lot of the documents, there's one of the, let's see, Abraham Lincoln's speech at a sanitary fair and the role of women, that sort of thing. Also monetary issues. Different states in the South had their own money, which of course was worthless. The Confederates had the, you know, they had the Confederate, and that wasn't very it wasn't worth anything either. It was highly inflationary. Certainly in the South, most of the destruction related to the war happens in the South. So, you know, lots of things are going to need to be rebuilt. They're going to pay really heavy economic consequences in the South. It's going to be pretty difficult sort of thing. Also, you know, in the middle of all this, there's westward movement and there's going to be displacement of Native Americans to reservations, and there's going to be a little bit of the beginning of the Western, the Plains Indians Wars. So there's a lot of stuff going on during this chapter. Women are going to get more involved in like sanitary commissions, that sort of stuff, public health, and army hospitals, military hospitals, because there are going to be so many casualties as a result of this war. They're going to need people to take care of those casualties. So you'll see lots of women, Clara Barton, that sort of thing, serving as nurses during this time period, but also just general kind of healthcare. And what they discover that's important, takes them a little while to adapt to other settings, is that keeping things sterile and clean really promote health. That is one of the things that they really figure out in the medical realm as a result of war. And if you study medical history, one of the things that you'll notice is a lot of times the biggest advancements in techniques and knowledge, that sort of thing, even procedures, medications, come because of war, because there's so many people to treat. It's not a good reason, but that is kind of the way that works. Oh my goodness, I feel like I talked forever, but it was the normal amount of time, wasn't it? Are you guys still there? Yeah, I feel like I talked a long time. All right. Trying to think if there's anything else we want to talk about today. I think because we will be able to cover all the material, we'll finish the last chapter tomorrow. That probably on Thursday, we can just review and go over the questions and stuff. Thanks for the whole birthday thing. I appreciate it. I thought about having extra credit for you if you can guess how old I was, but that never goes well. Never goes well. So, but I think we can do the review thing on Thursday if you're good with that. And I guess I can stop recording. Gosh, I hope the recording worked.